I apologize for those in the audience who are from New Orleans and the New Orleans area, because the intent was not to cause trauma, and sometimes seeing the destruction that occurred all over the city and community and region can re-traumatize in some ways. But we felt, DJ and I felt, in order to have a conversation, which is what we are going to have related to recovery and resilience, it was important to change the set a little bit and, show through pictures a little bit of what people were dealing with, and that'll be part of our conversation. The experiences that individuals have had following Hurricane Katrina, the difficulties coming back to New Orleans and rebuilding, but also what it means in terms of principles, not just structure, not just the physical rebuilding, but the psychological rebuilding. The other issue that needs to be considered also in this part of the country is multiple traumas and cumulative traumas. There have been hurricanes since Katrina that have impacted on the same communities. There's also the Gulf oil spill in 2010 that impacted on many lives in terms of livelihood and economy. It may not have destroyed homes and communities in the same way, but it certainly psychologically has had its impact. So if we could put on our PowerPoint right now, just so that we could see that we've decided to title our presentation, "The Importance of a Sense of Place and What It Means for Recovery." And I think that what we want to do this morning is help us gain a better understanding and you gain a better understanding of what we mean by a sense of place as it relates to recovery and resilience. And a sense of place is not just something we need to think about following disasters, and obviously there have been terrible disasters in this country the past week. I was contacted by a good colleague in Arkansas where there was so much destruction from tornadoes as well as other places. But really a sense of place we need to think about a lot, related to everything that many people in this room do every day, related to children and child welfare and foster care and abuse and neglect and other kinds of issues. So I am going to turn it over to DJ Markey right now for our first slide. And to move them, I guess I would have to be standing up there. If you could move, thank you, to the second slide. Oh. Thank you.
Well, we thought we would start with certainly recovery and resilience, because that's where we started when we first started talking about doing this kind of presentation. This is where we were. I told Joy I didn't understand recovery. I think it's too individualized at this point. And all of the comments you're going to hear from me and probably from Joy is in hindsight. Katrina is over. The BP disaster is over. I don't know what this hurricane season is going to bring, but as Joy said, disaster is all over the country at this point. So we all need to take a minute to just reflect on some of the stuff that's going on. Resilience, I think we have lots of people in this part of the country who are resilient. I always like to point out the last figure I heard, the last figure I saw, was that there was 100,000 people who left the city of New Orleans after Katrina who never came back. We like to think of them as our neighbors. I know there were some people who Pyramid worked with, my wife and I worked with, who we certainly have never seen since Katrina. So I think it's something we all, again, this is a very personal story. When we start talking about this in relationship to New Orleans, when we start talking about it in relationship to this part of the world. So I would hope that at the end of this presentation, that recovery and resilience kind of look a little different from how you first imagined this. in the beginning. I think we've come a long way, but there are some things that we do need to reflect on at this point that are hindsight, and they are 2020. There are things that we've come to know, and if anything happened again, I would like to think that we would do some things differently than we did the last time. That would be a good thing. That would be an outcome. I think you can take away from this just that you have to look at these things differently. When we start talking about communities and disaster, and see what it is that you should be doing, not what you think you should be doing. So again, hindsight is 2020, and just look at it from that perspective, and I think you can learn a lot. So let's go to the next slide.
So if we think about recovery or resilience, and you can see we put definitions up there, it's important, again, to bear in mind the psychology of it as well. So I started to think a lot about the importance of place and a sense of place related to some experiences that we've had in New Orleans and the New Orleans area for the last 8+ years, almost 9 years, following Hurricane Katrina. And one of the things that we learned was much more about the psychology of what it means to be part of a community, and that's actually where DJ and I have come together. So a couple of experiences that we had that I think are very important. So we mentioned the numbers of children and families that couldn't return, and it was about 3 years after Hurricane Katrina when we were called by the West Baton Rouge schools. So a lot of the work that we do is integrated into school systems in terms of trying to give more support and collaboration with schools, and a lot of work in the community. So in the East Baton Rouge school, they had at least 2,000 children who were from New Orleans, and families were not able to come back. They wanted to come back, but they couldn't rebuild. They didn't have the finances to rebuild, and other types of things. There are many people in the community who left and set up new communities elsewhere that we well know, but these people really wanted to come back, and they asked if we could help. And so we had been doing screenings in collaboration with schools, and we suggested this might be helpful for them to learn more about how the children were feeling and what their experiences were. And we also look at mental health symptoms. I'm a mental health person. And for these children in the school, and it's on a later slide, but I wanted to talk about it now, they reported many, many more symptoms of both depression and post-traumatic stress symptoms than children we were able to match with who had been able to come back to New Orleans. And for people who are from this region, but other people saw pictures, you know, areas of New Orleans some areas still don't look as great as the downtown area or this hotel that took, 7 years to rebuild? But there were people who had been able to come back to some of the neighborhoods where these children were from. We matched them by zip codes, and the symptom level was much, much higher in the children who were in Baton Rouge. That helped us start to think about a sense of place. Another experience that we had that helped us start to think about a sense of place and what it means in a community is in areas where homes were being rebuilt, and there were a lot of people coming down to rebuild homes. People were enthusiastic when their homes were being rebuilt and the help they were getting, but when they moved back in their homes, they became depressed and unhappy. And it became very clear that it had to do with a sense of community. The schools weren't there, the groceries weren't there, and the neighbors weren't there, and their friends weren't there. And it made us think a lot more about the importance of a sense of place. So on the one hand, as we have on the PowerPoint, A community can be defined as a neighborhood or a town or a city or a particular area. And New Orleans, you know, as we all know, has very, very strong and long roots for many of the families that are here. I've been here over 25 years, and DJ told me it's okay. I can say I'm from New Orleans now, but we have very strong roots, so that we really need to think of communities and a sense of place psychologically. And we need to think about what it means in terms of relationships much more and even more than location. And I think that's particularly important for communities where there's a lot of culture and a lot of and extended families and areas that become part of the soul as well as just part of where you live. So I don't know if you have any more comments related to it?
No.
Okay, we'll move on. Okay, here we go.
This is something that I think when we talk about locally based community research and how it emerges, we saw examples of this after people started coming back after Katrina. I was out of here. I was in Mississippi my wife and I were in Mississippi for 7.5 months before we could get back here. There's certainly some people who were out a lot longer, some people shorter, depending on your individual situation. But the thing that emerged is that people started making plans. They didn't care about or didn't have conversations with folks who were living in communities. They felt like, you know, this is what we should do. There's a part of this that has to do with just basic common decency when it comes to talking to folks about what's happening to their lives. I think especially when you start talking about disasters, there's a lot of emotion and there's lots of things that need to be considered. But unless you're willing to have those conversations and engage in those conversations with people who have been inside this disaster or been affected dramatically by it, you're not going to solve problems for people. I remember the neighborhood I lived in, there were some people who had already started planning who decided that my community was going to become green space. So just think about it for a second. You're coming back home, you've been away for 7.5 months, and somebody tells you, oh, I saw this newspaper article that says that they were going to turn where you live into green space. I said, what do you mean green space? They said, oh, they're just going to, you know, tear it down and, you know, put a pond there or something. Well, you know, the people in that community, that didn't go over too well. They decided that they wanted their community back. And this is not, I say that in terms of where I live, but there were other parts of New Orleans that had the same kind of, you know, they went through the same kind of thing where people started telling them, we're not bringing that back. That's just going to have to go. You lived in the lower ninth ward, tough. You know, we have other designs for it. So who's making these decisions? Who are they talking to? Needless to say, you know, that can cause a chain reaction where people live becomes a part. As George said, place does matter. People lived in neighborhoods. They had communities. They had friendships and relationships. And it's one of the things I can say about Katrina. We all lost a lot. You know, when I look around this room essentially is a community of people who work in the area of abuse and neglect. They work with families. So there is people who can talk to each other. That didn't exist for people when we came back after Katrina. All those relationships you had, the school system itself was gone. The relationships you had with people in the school system was gone. The helping professions, all that was gone. So you were thrown back on your own devices, and that doesn't work. Believe me, it does not. It's too difficult to make decisions when all you have is just you, or you decide that some handful of professionals are going to make these decisions for you. So we have to find a way, and again, this is hindsight. If ever you're involved with any communities and any disasters, you have to bring communities together to talk about what do they want to see happen now. How do they want to rebuild? What do they see as the priorities? And you have to ask those questions, and you have to be open to challenging the people who are actually making decisions to listen to the people who are there and, try to make something happen that's going to bring them into this conversation in a way that makes them feel good about them participating. Because we all know, look, this has to be, it's not just about people in general. It has to be a community, which includes government, which includes the people in it, which includes the schools. All the institutions have to be a part of a discussion to bring something back. And if we can get to that, we'll probably have a much different kind of outcome. As I said, I know people and myself and others who were involved in conversations like this after Katrina, and some of it was lacking. It's convincing people of something that we shouldn't be trying to convince you of in the middle of a disaster. You should be trying to help people get back to what they think their community is supposed to be and try to do something about the loss that they're going to feel or are feeling when they're dealing with this sort of thing. So I think that's where we are, and we're still there to a certain extent. And I hope that we can continue to have a conversation, because it's been tough going. And I say that in light of the fact that this happened in 2005, but now we're in 2014, and we still haven't arrived at a place where there are some areas of the city where those conversations still haven't been had. So let's look to see if we can move that stuff forward.
I'm actually thinking I was going to make a comment about also integrating support for people in communities too. One of the things we talked about is the importance of professionals of various backgrounds really listening to people in the community, but also talking to people in the community, because for example, there are a lot of mental health issues that come up around disasters. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work, as a number of us have for many years, and there are a lot of mental health issues that come up. But the idea of somebody coming into an office and sitting down and talking about their concerns just isn't going to happen, and isn't going to be supportive, frankly. And actually, as we're talking, it makes me think of the amount of time, we're going to talk about another area too, spent down at the command center at Harris. I don't know how many of you were around then at the command center, but really what struck me in terms of going on there, that was the command center for the first responders and the health care people, was when you know people in the community and have met them before, there were so many people who were relieved to see a mental health person there, and it wasn't to do therapy, it was to talk, because mental health people in general are trained to listen. And we also tried to help with some immediate kinds of problems and stress, but I was thinking about that, and one of the things that we talked about in our conversation in planning the plenary also had to do with professionals and communities, community people working together and figuring that out and listening to each other. So one of the approaches that I was saying we've always had is, we work in various communities, is to have the communities sit down with people in the community, have them identify who we ought to be sitting down with, and listen in order to figure out ways to provide more support, as opposed to people going in and saying, well, I know you're having these problems or these problems and this is what you need. And I think that is very consistent with what we're talking about, and I know you have much more to say about this.
Well, I think we have to bring the whole thing about professional dialogue into this, because again, we're talking with a room full of professionals. But I know that everybody here pretty much knows that you have to bring this down to a level where you're talking to people who have been hurt. Their world has been kind of crumbled, kind of dashed. First, you have to restore the idea that there is hope, that we can change this, that resilience is real, that you can recover. All that stuff is a part of how we got back to where we are now. When we look around New Orleans now, yeah, there's been change, absolutely. Yes, there's been rebuilding, and yes, there has been recovery. But there's still some lingering questions about how do we talk about certain things. I mean, for me, the pet peeve has been, because that's where I work in the school systems and with the school systems, it's what they did and how they did it, what decisions were made, who was left out, were they concerned with anything that we thought about what happened to schools in our communities. These questions are still lingering, and lots of people here are still looking for answers. So it's a long-term conversation, but it's one that I would really hope to be able to say this to people in this room. When people come to you, whether it's in light of a disaster or whether they want to propose that they do something different, especially with something as fundamental to communities as schools, we have to listen very thoroughly to what they have to say at first, and then you have to decide. This isn't a decision to be made by some people in a state capitol somewhere. This is too fundamental when we're talking about schools that happen in communities where people live, where their children are being raised. It's what do they want for their children. And in hindsight, again, as we look at it, there were things that they didn't do. And that's why we're still trying to have this conversation. Especially the kids with disabilities, as we know, privatization has not worked for them. They've been kind of left out of this conversation altogether. It's part of the reason why you have a group of disabled kids, families that are suing the state. They don't feel like they got what they deserved, what they needed, and that's still going on. It's been going on for about 3 years now. So again, we have to pay attention to that sort of thing, and we have to be a part of that conversation, because that's the only way these families, these kids, are going to get what they thought they were supposed to. People have expectations. Disaster doesn't kill your expectations for your children, but if they do something to your school system that does, then you have to address it. Like I said, education is too important. It's foundational. It's what, in many cases, especially here in a city like New Orleans, it's what communities are built around. They're built around the schools. So be mindful and be prepared to have those conversations.
So if we could go back to the PowerPoint a minute. So I don't know how many of you have thought about a sense of place. I told you that I've been thinking about it a lot, and what makes a place special or unique, and why we would have a sense of belonging. But it's really, really important for children and families. And so many of you work with abused and neglected children and work in and around the child welfare system. And these children really, unfortunately are moved a great deal and from family to family, and thought a lot about how they're able to get a sense of place and what it means. And so I think the concept is one that's very important to, obviously, all of the work that all of you do. So I already mentioned the kind of findings that we had related to symptoms with children who weren't able to come home. I think we also need to think about the relationship between health and mental health, and it became very apparent to us. We were in, working all over the state, but we were in St. Francisville, which obviously is very, very different from New Orleans. We were there because there were a lot of children, young children, adolescents, and families that were evacuated there. And they also have a school-based health clinic. And one of the issues that was coming up a lot were health issues that occur as well, and the link between health and mental health. And I really don't think that we paid that much attention to it, and that also relates to a sense of place, because it raises the stress level if one isn't able to have a sense of place and know where you're from and how you're from there. So you may wonder why I'm putting a picture up of the ecstasy of the Carnival cruise lines, but it's a way to be able to talk about a sense of place. So a lot of you may not know, some of you do know, that 80% of our first responders, police, firefighters, government workers, lost their homes with Hurricane Katrina, and they had to be on the job and they had to work. So it was arranged by FEMA, whatever, or maybe Carnival Cruise decided to volunteer. I never quite heard the story, but there were two cruise ships, the Ecstasy and the Sensation, docked at Julia Street Harbor to house the first responders. And we were working closely in the city just as mental health people. And oh, I learned, by the way, at that time, if I hadn't learned before, being from LSU was really great, because you say you're from LSU. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of LSU people who think it's great anyhow, but people trusted you, had immediate trust if you said you were from LSU. But we decided on the ships, on the Ecstasy and Sensation, that first of all we needed to get families back, we needed to get children back. So because there were all these men and women who were working in the city every day, and they were separated from their families and they were worried about their families. So we talked to the Coast Guard and we talked to FEMA and NOPD and others and said, let's get the children and families back on the boat. And they said no. And we said, you don't understand. It's gonna be much better for them if the families can come back. So we convinced them, and by November, there were about 365 children on these boats. Well, what we realized was, with all these children, I mean, no, the schools weren't open in New Orleans. There were some on the West Bank or other places. We had to help find schools for the children, which we did in collaboration with the Department of Education. But also, we had to find childcare for the younger children. So all these people who came down to volunteer, the SAMHSA volunteers, we said, we want people who have knowledge about children and can work with children. And they, again, thought we were crazy. And we said, no, you don't understand. We have to set up child care centers on the boats for the children. And the only reason I tell this story is what we realized was, we actually didn't realize it that much at the time, but we realized it when some people came to visit. They said, there's a sense of community on this boat. You know, because there were programs for the children, and we were able to, the partners of the first responders were able to take responsibility, and the children were picked up by school buses on the dock to go to school, and there was a sense of routine and normality. And some people visited the Department of Education and talked about this sense of community, and I couldn't help think about that. And I want to show you the next slide, if you would put it up, please. It's also, I don't think I can bring it up, can I? The next one, please. Oh, no, go back one, please. Okay, so it was 2005, and it was Halloween, and there were lots of children on the boat. So NOPD, actually it was the detectives and the child abuse unit and all of those joined with us, and we had a Halloween party on the boat, for which we all enjoyed as well. And our mental health people, I don't know if Michelle Maney's in the room, but she had a room on the boat, and we had a room on the boat and did a lot of help support for families related to that. But I guess the reason I thought of this example when we were talking about recovery and sense of community is, sometimes it's a different community than what you think it's being, and I can't say everybody was 100% happy, being on the boat. They were not. But at the same time, there are supportive things that are really important for children and families. In unusual circumstance, we used to talk about it as the new normal in many ways. So we thought that this slide was important also, that you really can't separate what happens early in life from and how children develop and families from the destiny of the community. And you also can't separate displacement that occurs for children and families from the destiny of the community. And I think that people have failed to look at some of these issues when displacement occurs, and it affects children differently in different ways. And it's one of the reasons that we always talk about from a recovery point of view, in this new normal environment or whatever it is, to have a sense of routine and things that are familiar with the family so that they can feel a sense of community. And we've learned a lot related to that. As DJ says, we have a lot more we need to learn related to how to do that. But some of the experiences there have been really, I think, important and helpful for us to figure out. As you say, you talk about hindsight. We've learned a lot. We did a much better job, by the way, when Hurricane Gustav came in supporting children and families. It missed the city, and we felt bad about the trauma that people experienced in having to evacuate, but they were supported in the evacuation, both when they left and when they came back. We were part of that, and so that we could support children and families in that way. So if we could go to I can go to the next one.
Well, this ties right into what Joy was talking about. I think we did, where systems are needed to support the collective use of best practices. Within any organization, whether you're in a school system, whether you're in a mental health system, doing counseling or whatever. And I think we realized that we had to invent some things, some supports, reinvigorate some systems in order to make sure that the needs of children especially were being met. So that sense of community could be there. It's absolutely necessary. We think that dislocation certainly caused problems. I don't think we certainly invested enough in trying to solve some of those problems. But at the same time, I think we can do this better because we've had this experience. We know that we have to make sure that the systems are in place. So like we've had a real dress rehearsal. How do you make sure that the systems are supported and that best practices are absolutely in place, especially when you're dealing with children and with families? So I would hope that this is a lesson learned, whether it's again, the work that we've done was all in the schools. And we looked at, how do you put systems in place to deal with issues of inclusion? How do you deal with positive behavior support? What do you do for mental health counseling in these schools as you reconstitute them? What is the plan? How are you going to bring best practices back into effect here? I think we could have had a better conversation. We could have had a deeper conversation, one that could have done some things differently. But if we've had this conversation, if we know this is true, again, in hindsight, can we do something better if we're ever faced with that situation again? I think we can. But we all have to be clear that there are some things that we must do if we want to really protect children. So, keep it in your mind if you're ever in that situation, that you can protect. But it has to be a proactive effort. not one done in hindsight.
So if we could have the slides up again, please. We have the next slide.
Okay. This is, I guess, a difficult thing for people who came back to the city after Katrina, because the one thing I guess most people who worked with folks, I mean, in neighborhoods all around the city understood that there was poverty here already, but after Katrina, the poverty rate in the schools was dramatic. You had kids that had enormous needs. But for anything you could look at, any indicator you looked at, poverty was an issue. If there were some undesirable outcomes you were looking for, you could always count on the fact that the people you were working with, the communities you were working with, poverty was always there. I don't have any answers to this. I think this is the thing that requires a much broader conversation. And I mean much broader than New Orleans or Louisiana. This is a national conversation that we need to be having. Because you have to understand that children put in situations like that of disaster are the ones who suffer the most, as far as I can tell. We have to, as a country, as a community, the national community, to address this in a much different way. We don't want our children to suffer, but we can't be left to our own devices. This is a very rich country. What is it that we want? This conversation has to be had at a much different level, but it has to be, what kind of country do you want to live in? If there's a disaster like Katrina, where most of the people in the city have to leave, what is it that you want your federal government to do? What is it you want it to do for your children? And like my wife used to say, you think your highest best thought, and then you got a shot. If you don't, I can tell you, I mean, basically what we saw after Katrina and what we saw happening to kids, we didn't like. We didn't like the poverty that existed here. We still don't. So you have to begin to address that question, and it has to be addressed at a national level, because these disasters are real, and they have real impact on children. And the impact on these children is not like a year or 2 years, 3 years. It's 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 years down the road. So again, what do you want? What kind of country you want to live in? How do you want your children treated? And let's see if we can have that kind of national dialogue. Let's see if we can make that happen, because I think we're going to have to. If we have any respect at all for the work that I can see this group does, we're going to have to, somebody's going to have to provide the leadership for having this kind of dialogue. This is not something that can be left to somebody else or some other group. The groups that are like this one, who are involved with abuse and neglect of children, have to take this up as a way of saying we can go to another level. And I think we can, but we have to have the will to do that. So it's something to be mindful of. It's something to remember when you're talking about recovery and resilience, that this is a real subject that has to be talked about.
And our children are placed at such high risk. You know, we know that Louisiana is number 2 in poverty and has been number 2 in poverty, and it doesn't seem to be changing. very quickly, and that places the children and families at greater risk. If you put on the next slide, I want to talk to you a little bit about what we heard from the children when they were in communities and when they didn't have their sense of place that's so important. So many of them talked about feeling different and that they didn't fit and that they were newcomers and that the children teased them. And they teased them about the way they talked, and they teased them about the way they dressed, and they teased them about the way they ate. And when DJ is talking about the impact not just at the time, but down the road, so when they finally do get back here, you know, their self-esteem has been impacted. And then many of the children we talked to, you know, had a lot of guilt. They had a lot of guilt that some of their friends weren't able to even get away like they were. I know that we talked to many of the children who talked about that. And then so many of these families became more disorganized in the communities that they were at. One of the things that we've actually been seeing in 5- and 6-year-old children for the last few years is, you know, more struggles than you would expect in other 5- and 6-year-old children because of all the disruptions in families. So the issue of not fitting and losing their sense of belonging impacted them at very vulnerable times in their lives and may still be impacting on many of the children, which is why hindsight is so important, so that, you know, should a future disaster strike, we figure out a way to be more supportive of the children and families than occurred at that time. This is what we heard from a little 5-year-old who was having a lot of trouble adjusting. You know, if I only had my old room back, I'd be good. You know,
I had that same problem myself. If I had my old room back, I'd be.
Yeah, and then so one of the things that we actually found in some of our work was, you know, we talk here, and there's a big concentration here on the younger children with abuse and neglect. The teenagers were getting into a lot of trouble with their difficulties with a sense of belonging and fitting and all of that. I mean, there wasn't much for them to do. If they were able to move back to some neighborhoods, there weren't, you know, any activities for them. And some of them moved back when there wasn't even electricity in various areas. So that's just an invitation to teenagers who have all kinds of ideas of things to do anyhow to get into trouble. And so we partnered with some of the school systems to say, okay, what can these young people do to give back to their community? You know, and some of the school teachers were talking about that. Well, this is one of the things. They also did some rebuilding around their schools in various places, and even though the schools were new, to bring back some of the kinds of things that went on. But this was another thing that they were doing. They planted trees. And it was a way to involve young people. One of the things we forget about are the teenagers sometimes, because they aren't as dependent on their families and parents, but boy, they can get into difficulty if they don't have things to do. And they weren't necessarily children who would have been in difficulty before, but it's just, you know, with all of the disruptions and everything that occurs, that was an important part of what we saw. The other thing that we did as well was one of the things that we did in terms of partnering with schools that were reopening, including Head Starts and early Head Starts, is just hang around. You know, mental health people, some of them don't think about hanging around, but it's really important. And some of the school people said to us, you know, we really don't need mental health around here. We just need to get the children back to school. And we asked their permission to just hang around. And what we actually found, and they found, was everybody had to come and tell their story. You know, even if they weren't able to be back in their home, but they were back in a school in their neighborhood or in their area. In some neighborhoods there weren't any places to go, but they could be at least in a school setting, and then they had to tell their stories. And the people in education realized that it wasn't a bad idea to have mental health people around to listen to the stories. But not only did the children tell their stories, the parents had to tell their stories, and the teachers had to tell their stories. It's very important, by the way, to tell your stories with trauma, when you've gone through that, because if you don't talk about the trauma and you don't recognize the trauma, it doesn't go away. So I think some of the people in education at the youngest level, Head Start and Early Head Start, as well as in the schools, recognized how important that was. Another thing actually that we learned from the children was how they told their stories. So some children tell their stories with words, and some children tell their stories with pictures. And we had a lot of pictures that children drew, which was a way for them to tell their story. This was just one that was done by one child. As you can see, it was in the fall of 2005 into the 2006. But it's all about talking and listening and talking together. And you know, I might not understand, and it's likely I wouldn't understand the stories in the same way as DJ would, but I'm willing to partner with him and say, okay, you know, help me understand and see if there are ways that I can be helpful. And we actually sat around those tables a lot before Katrina. But I think that the idea of not someone else defining what it means to recover and what it means to be resilient in a community, but really talking to people in the community and listening as to what makes a difference for them, and then trying to figure out ways to help support that is really important.
The only thing I just want to say, let me just, I feel privileged to be talking to a group like this. I know everybody, there are priorities here. And I know children are at the high end of your priorities. So I feel compelled to say some things about the security of children going into the future and about the issue of disasters in communities. Because I just want people to understand that it can happen to you. I think most of us now, I know we all in this part of the world, we understand it, and when we look around and we look at the news every day, we understand there are other parts of the country experiencing these same kinds of things. So I think it's time for all of us to go to that other place when we start talking about issues that have to do with children and their welfare going forward. We have to take this a bit seriously, because I don't know, my experiences after Katrina, some people didn't take this as seriously as they should have. And some kids got lost. I don't think anybody who's worked in the school systems or lived in this community is going to tell you anything different. We lost some, and we know we did. We don't want to lose kids to a disaster. We don't have to. We're smarter than that. We know more. We've had this experience. The dress rehearsal is over. We need to get together and do what we got to do, because it's for us to do. It's not for anybody else to do. It's for us to do. So thanks and for letting me come and rant.
I just wanted to say a short thank you as well. I think the vision of the National Conference on Child Abuse and Neglect to feel that it was very important in our community, in our city, to talk about issues of whether it's recovery or resilience, but the issues that a lot of us have been thinking about for a long time, and the vision of bringing us together. You know, I think I thank you very much also, and I hope that some of you will join with us in thinking about a sense of place and what that might mean for the children that you work with. I know you may think about it, but maybe some new ideas related to that. So I thank you very much as well.